I will always claim that I think the most creative work comes out of the nonprofit sector. I think far more so than the for-profit private sector or government, and not that they're not critical partners, but if you really want the innovative problem solving, if that's what you get excited by and want to lend your talents and time and skills to, I really think the nonprofit sector is the best place for that.
You're listening to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast with host May Harris.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast. Today, my guest is Geoff Green, who is the CEO of the California Association of Nonprofits. Now, he took the reins from an amazing former CEO, Jan Masoka, and I'm so excited to speak with Geoff today. Welcome to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast, Geoff.
Thank you so much, May. Yes, you're correct. I stepped into the shoes of a legend. So.
Absolutely. It's got to be kind of tough, but I'm actually really excited to see your initiatives and what you plan to do with the California Association of Nonprofits. So maybe we can start by introducing our listeners to what CalNonprofits actually does, and then go from there about what your initiatives are and what you're really currently working on.
Certainly. Thank you for that. So CalNonprofits has been around 40 years now. We're actually coming up on our 40th anniversary. And we were founded for a couple of reasons. Back in the mid 80s, actually, there were a number of challenges for nonprofits. One in particular was actually getting insurance coverage. So by an interesting quirk of history, we were founded both with an insurance agency focused on nonprofits, as well as the parent 501c3 nonprofit, which is CalNonprofits. So it's an interesting model, but the mission of CalNonprofits is really threefold. So we're an advocate for the sector, and we claim to be the voice of California's nonprofit sector, which I think we can back up.
I think that's a given. Absolutely.
We're also an educational resource. So we try to make sure that the most current information, especially around the more obscure subjects around compliance and the interactions with state and county agencies and such, are ready and at the fingertips of our nonprofit members and beyond, and in data and research. So we try to take a look at map the sector as a whole. So really, it's about building the power and influence of the nonprofit sector, claiming what is already true, and using that to make sure that we have a seat at the table to inform policy decisions that are made. Primarily focused on the state level, but we're also working in regional coalitions of various types, and we do occasionally work at a federal level too.
Okay. So you've been in the sector for a really long time. I looked at your LinkedIn page and what you have accomplished. You've done so much in your career. Maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about what brought you here, because I think what your background has really lent itself to at CalNonprofits is a full kind of 360-degree view of the sector from all sorts of perspectives. What are you really bringing to CalNonprofits?
Well, so I will admit, I'm a longtime CalNonprofits member. I actually first discovered CalNonprofits in the probably late, I think I pegged it at 1998, when I was leading a small foundation in the Central Coast of California. And as I just mentioned, was looking for nonprofit insurance coverage for my colleagues, which were actually just two at the time. That was sort of my first introduction to the organization. I've also served on the board, chaired the board previously, served on the policy committee. So my link to the organization goes much deeper than the day job of being CEO as of January. But they were always an entity that I looked to. I personally have a broad range of work and interests in the sector. I have, for most of my adult life, worked in the nonprofit sector. A lot of that's actually been fundraising. Some of it's been coalition building. Some of it's been political advocacy. There's a kind word for it all, which is Renaissance person. And then there's the just straight up unfocused, which is also fair.
Might be a little of both. Just a little. Yeah,
exactly. There's no, I like to tell when I'm doing fundraising trainings, I like to tell people, there's no 5-year-old that wakes up and says, I want to be a fundraiser. That doesn't happen. You find it and discover it later on out of necessity, usually. And then for those of us that actually enjoy it, we might make it a profession. The nonprofit sector as well is really not, if you were to ask someone what it is, it's really hard to define. And that's sort of counterintuitive. But the fact is that 501c3, its tax status is not a business model. And so an organization can be anything from an all-volunteer local, it could be a PTA, it could be a nonprofit. House of Faith could be a nonprofit. a Boys and Girls Club, a youth education program, all the way up to and including some of our largest health providers and institutions of higher learning. And that's all within that same umbrella. I've worked in many of those different forms of nonprofit. And if you take all that together, it is a really powerful part of our civil society. And that's where I kind of come down. I've worked in public spheres as well, and a little bit in private for-profit, but I've always come back to the nonprofit sector. And the way I look at it is what we are is if you can find a profit motive and a revenue model that will actually earn someone something, the private sector for-profit might be able to take care of that issue or solve that problem or work in that space. And if you can build the political will to get something done, you can do it through the public sector. But for everything else, it falls to the nonprofit sector to do it. And so we do a lot of solving problems. We are seen as really nice people that most people like to spend time. But in fact, we're also a really powerful part of the economic sector. The state of California, we're the fourth largest employer. And that blows people's minds usually when they see that. In fact, if you put just wages, it's the third largest employer. So the biggest part of that is actually our healthcare sector, but it is really a massive part of our communities, our economy. So whether you're working on social justice issues or direct service issues or bigger theoretical frameworks, that's all within that nonprofit sector.
Absolutely. It's one thing that's always bothered me, because I kind of started similarly to you, at least in my relationship with CalNonprofits. It was when I was an executive director of a small organization looking for insurance coverage, interestingly enough. And it always bothered me, and it's continued to bother me, that the entire sector is known, the name for it is by something they aren't. It's like counterintuitive. Just because you're not organized for profit making for shareholder doesn't mean, that's not what you should be defined by. So, when I was starting For Purpose Law Group, that's why I chose that name. It's like, why is this whole amazingly robust sector defined by something it isn't? We needed to start defining it by something it is. For purpose. A purpose-driven organization or sector. And I'd love if we could move in that direction, but it seems so entrenched.
Yeah, and that is one of the best sort of starting points for analysis on the sector. And I've heard many of our colleagues, like they come from that same place. Who else defines themselves first by what they're not? That's a fairly strange way to look at the sector. And I think a lot of us that enter into this work do it first for the mission, the passion for a particular issue. I will always claim that I think the most creative work comes out of the nonprofit sector. I think far more so than the for-profit private sector or government, and not that they're not critical partners, but if you really want the innovative problem solving, if that's what you get excited by and want to lend your talents and time and skills to, I really think the nonprofit sector is the best place for that. And there are some challenges there. We are not broadly embraced to take a lot of risks all the time. People don't necessarily understand what it takes to build a nonprofit model to solve a particular problem. But when it happens, it's some of the most interesting work out there. And so that's, it's always drawn me back.
Not only that, the nonprofit sector can be that innovative problem solver using the fraction of the resources or funds that other, organizations or businesses sometimes need to draw to solve those kinds of problems. So getting back to CalNonprofits, I've always been impressed with the impact and the advocacy and the resources available to nonprofits that CalNonprofits puts out. I mean, you do reports, you do advocacy, legislative updates, which is, just going through whatever's happening in the legislature at any given time is really important, especially for nonprofits that might not have the time to really research those things themselves. So what are you seeing, coming down the pike in 2024 and to 2025 that nonprofits in California and maybe even nationwide should be aware of?
Well, we could take the rest of our time together just to cover that list. There's a lot out there. I think I could probably put it into a few categories of what we see. And let me start with maybe the things that we've made some progress on. So the last 18 months, roughly, we've been focused on really the relationship between public agencies, governments, and the nonprofit sector. So we ran a series of bills to just most organizations that engage in policy are, by necessity split between the responsive role, which is you see something coming and you either jump up to try to steer it or stop it. And so there's a reactive role to policy work. And we've done that for many years. What we went into last year for the first time really was to sponsor a package of bills with a really connected theme. And that's all around contracting. So we called it the Nonprofit Equity Initiative, and we're still in that. There were 7 bills that we helped to bring through the state legislature, and they all focused on the relationship between the state and sometimes other public partners and the nonprofit sector. There's a group that we convene that we refer to as the Contracting Coalition. In California, there's 22 organizations that are part of that. And we got everyone organized along with our partners behind these reforms to make the state a better partner to the sector. And one of the things, and just yesterday I was giving a presentation to a group of funders, and people forget that the majority of revenue in the nonprofit sector comes first from earned income and secondly from public sources. And it's only third that philanthropy comes in. And the majority of that is individuals. So although we spend a lot of time talking about what a particular foundation may do because they're an identifiable, well-known entity, we don't spend as much time thinking about the real baseline revenue model of the sector, which is earned income and public partnerships. And so that's a lot of what we tried to do was right-size that and improve the ways that the state works with the sector. We had one big win, and right now it's the implementation year. So that was in California, Assembly Bill 590. Which was carried by Assemblymember Greg Hart, and it was to simply enable the state to make a 25% upfront investment in any contractor grant they made. So it was an advanced payment bill. And as you, I'm sure know, one of the big challenges in partnering with public entities, funders of all types, what you get is a slow payment, usually a reimbursement model. And the problem for a lot of nonprofits that are smaller is they don't have that capital sitting around. So you can't sign on to that contract and just get going, which is what the state is sort of expecting. And instead, nonprofits will have to pause. They'll have to take out debt. And of course, that's not reimbursable. So what we're trying to do is enable the state to be a better partner. And that was the big win. We got it through both houses unanimously, signed by the governor, and that's now law. And now the question is, how do we implement that from agency to agency and make it work? So there's a lot around the contracting. There was a small, what we call a micro grants bill that actually was being, it's reintroduced now. It didn't make it to the governor's desk last year, and that means any small grant of $20,000 or more gets paid up front. There's a bill limiting the discretion of funding agencies to withhold payment for small deviations from an original budget plan. So there's a lot of things just about the efficiency, removing barriers, and making those partnerships work better. So that's a whole area of work, I would say. There's an issue in California with a law that I believe is unique to the state at this point, and that is known as PAGA. It's the Private Attorneys General's Act. And
Yes.
that is something that you might be familiar with in the legal world.
I'm actually quite familiar with that. Yes.
And so that's come up a lot lately. So there's now an effort on it's a 20-year-old law. It was passed and signed in 2004. And there has now been a series of abuses of that by attorneys really just seeking the payday. It's not something that was really on anyone's radar until more recently. But what tends to happen is that someone it enables, as you know, I'll just explain that for anyone listening. It enables an individual to have the standing to go sue an employer seeking remedy for any violation of labor code, labor law. And instead of having to go through the labor commissioner's office or the attorney general, it empowers the individual to sue on their own behalf or a colleague or a group of workers in an organization. Some of those are nonprofits. And smaller agencies go immediate to settlement because they don't have the resources to fight a lawsuit like that. So what's the abuse that has been charged is that, and this has been backed up by what the state has found when they've looked at these cases, is that some of these are for tiny clerical issues, and instead they go lawsuit, they get a settlement. Most of that settlement money actually does not go to the worker, it goes to the attorneys or the firm. And so that's considered abuse, certainly of the spirit of the law, probably of the letter of the law. And there's a big effort right now to adjust that. On one end, you have folks who want to repeal that. I don't know that we would come down on that. I think actually having protections for workers is something we've always supported, and we want to make sure it's there. But this kind of abuse, we want to see if we can fix. So we're trying to figure out where our role may be in that. And there's no answer for us just yet. Part of what we're doing is talking to our members and looking at at what the impact has been for them. Most of the impact has been on for-profit organizations, so it's harder to figure out what's the nonprofit role. So that's an emerging one. Wages are certainly a big one. California has just instituted a number, in addition to having one of the highest minimum wages in the country because of the cost of, they say living, I say housing. It's really housing that causes that cost of living explosion in most of the state of California. And there are now additional minimums in certain sectors. And so the challenge for us is, we want to see those wages go up, and we want to figure out how do you do that in a way that actually is supported back to the contracting question by the funders of our agencies. So what you might have in the challenge for the nonprofit sector is a relatively low wage role, but a federal or state grant that doesn't allow you to pay more to catch up with prevailing wages, livable wages. And that's, of course, what we're ultimately after. The irony of nonprofit organizations actually creating poverty while fighting poverty is a big challenge for us. We have some models, and it's usually older models where they're funded in a particular way and they're paying low wages. And so they want to pay more, but they are prohibited from doing that by the primary funding sources that they have. So unless they can go raise dollars for additional support of their own workers, we've got a real challenge there. So that's something that's coming. There's no specific legislation that we're working on there, but we're talking about how we might be more effective in some of those conversations. And there's always things that come out of the woodwork too. And so you just got to wait and see what happens. And we try to get ahead of it. I think really what we're trying to do is be, and many have said this before, but if you're a legislator and you're wondering, so what does the small business community think, or what does so-and-so think? We would like to be at the top of that list. We'd like to see people say, well, what would the nonprofit sector think of this? As a way of first analyzing a proposed piece of legislation.
Okay, so you speak about how important it is for nonprofits to understand this. What kind of mechanisms does CalNonprofits offer for nonprofit organizations to get involved, to give feedback, to become involved in this kind of effort?
Well, there's a number of things. We are, as I mentioned, we're really three parts. So on one hand, we are doing the legislative lobbying policy work in Sacramento and with our partners. And we're always inviting our members into that. So when we do some of that, serving as really the hub of that organizing, it's not just us, and it can't be, because that's not what's effective. What's effective is that we have 10,000 members and we have 60,000 people on our email list, and we reach out and say, look, this is something that's going to impact your work, but here's what we think we need to do. And we ask for folks to sign on. So we get hundreds of nonprofit organizations gathered around some of these positions and calling their legislators. And we teach people how to do that too. As I'm sure you also know, there's a lot of misinformation out in the world about what nonprofits can and can't do politically. And we do a lot to try to untrain people what they think they know that is not true, and then train them on what they can do and how it actually is part of their core work. And I believe that through and through. And that's something I've always worked in. And that's probably why I've ultimately chosen this path. I mean, I very much am a political junkie. I pay a lot of attention to the political policy world. But what I love most is the policy, the structural piece of it. I want to see how do you create a structure where greater equity, fairness, access, how do you do that in a way? And policy is one of the best tools. And so what we do is we reach out to our members and we talk to them about how they can do that. We offer training and resources on how they can do that. We try to help boards that might be maybe the board that's the intransigent part of the organization that says, nope, we don't get involved in politics. And what they don't understand is that the firewall in nonprofits in the 501c3 world is partisanship. So that is the actual no-no. And that is what the Johnson Amendment is about. And that is what all the tax law says. So it's very clear that what is not okay is signing on with a candidate or a party or against a candidate or a party. Everything else in our political engagement is absolutely on the table. And there's rules about how to do it appropriately and transparency about how you share that. But that's what we want to see more organizations doing. And I come at it from the point of view of, can you imagine what our public policy would look like? Pick your favorite issue, pick housing, pick gender equity, pick climate, pick anything. If the people that know it best were writing the positions, if the public policy were actually written by those on the ground who know the work best, that's where we start.
Exactly.
And so we believe the nonprofits are that.
Who's better to advocate and to, inform than the people who have the boots on the ground and the organizations who are actually working in this day in and day out? I couldn't agree more. And thank you for bringing up the Johnson Amendment. It is an election year. of course. And so it always amazes me how many clients contact us. Oh, well, can't we host a luncheon for this candidate? He's aligned with our position. I'm like, no, you really can't. Let's invite both. Let's invite all the candidates. Then you can have as many lunches as you want. Just don't be partisan. But just a reminder, advocacy and partisanship or electioneering, very different things.
Exactly. And I because I like this stuff, and I know you do too. I study the Johnson Amendment. I pulled all the strings on that, on the sort of the tapestry of how we do and don't do policy work, and try to say, okay, so why is that? What's the structure there? Never did I think that the Johnson Amendment would emerge as a spoken out loud political issue in the modern world. I mean, that's been on the books for 75 years. It has been the easily agreed upon bipartisan framework of how the nonprofit sector should work. There's really been very little debate about that since the 1950s. And yet in the last decade, you started to see some folks start to really question that and try to work around it. And some of them very aggressively and directly. And, there have been movements around. There's a few
pending court cases on it as well. Like you said, it's like you think it's settled, but nope, not settled.
Well, and we know when we heard, presidential candidates in 2016 start to speak of it, I thought, what? Really? We're going to go here? And so today, as you probably know, last week, as we're recording this now, a new lawsuit in the federal tax court that theoretically could tear down that wall and remove, that restriction that has been in place for all this time. So what we try to do is we take that as, and I don't know if sacrosanct is the word, but that is absolutely a pillar of the rules of engagement as they should be for the nonprofit sector. And yet that's not really a problem. There's so much we can do and should be doing around policy and separate from partisanship. And I think that's what I like to see more and more of our nonprofit colleagues do.
Absolutely. When you think about it, 501c3s, they're operating on public funds, and members of the public, from all walks of political life and perspective need to be represented. So I agree with you. I wouldn't rip down the Johnson Amendment either, but it'll be interesting to see how this court case goes through.
Yeah. And that's, those are the kinds of things where what we do to engage people is invite them in, offer them the tools, and suggest that, there are ways that we can all, the voice of the nonprofit sector, if it were actually utilized to its fullest extent, would be incredibly powerful in our work. And we just are often that's not where people are always focused. So what we try to do is, take the knowledge that you have, take the experience that you have, which is as good or better than anybody else in the conversation as a nonprofit person, and let's bring that to bear on our political choices in our communities, in our states, in our country. And that's what we want to see. We just want to see better political engagement. I don't think politics is a bad word. I think, we talk about policy, advocacy, politics. That's all good stuff. That's part of doing the work. It's not a separate thing that needs to be avoided. Now, partisanship, that's separate. But everything else, we really should be at the conversation. One of my favorite adages is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's kind of how I see the sector. So if we're not at the table, and it's true, all budgets. I mean, budgets are really moral documents, they're value statements. And so I don't want to hear what you say you're about, and just show me where it is in your budget. And the nonprofit sector needs to be saying that constantly.
Excellent point. Well, so one thing you might not know is this is my 20th podcast episode. I'm so excited to have you, Geoff, as my guest on my 20th podcast episode. So as we sign off, is there anything that you would like to add? Maybe an invitation on becoming a member to CalNonprofits, if appropriate, or anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, let me finish this last section of our conversation. By the way, happy anniversary.
Oh, thank you.
Let me start with this little tidbit, which I think is a great way to think about it. If you look consistently since the middle of the last century, since the end of World War II, it's been roughly a 20-to-1 expenditure ratio between what the charitable sector is, that $1, $20. So for every $1 in our charitable sector, $1, there are $20 of public expenditure. So if we want to solve any problem, you're not going to undo bad choices with those $20 with your $1. That's not going to work. What you got to do is take that $1 and influence how the other 20 are spent and have better outcomes, and then work in support of whatever your passionate issue is. So I think there's some mathematics to this as well. And that's another reason why engagement is important. So CalNonprofits is here as a resource. We're here to help folks know what's happening. And we tend to work on the things that are not the core passions and missions that folks are pursuing. We have a lot of great people doing that work. What we try to do is look at the common cause, or the back end of the system, the business model, the compliance issues, all those really important but not really sexy things that people have to figure out and work on, and then offer people the tools to do that. So membership is accessible. We invite any and everyone. You don't even have to be a nonprofit in California. We have members outside the state. We have funders, that we have individuals. But we're really here to be a resource and also a collective voice for the sector. And that's what we're trying to accomplish.
I was unaware of this whole $20, $1 kind of thing. And I think you said it very well, that CalNonprofits can be the leverage to get the voice of the $1, that one sole little dollar, getting the voice out and adding some leverage there. So thank you for sharing that. Well, thank you for being an excellent guest, Geoff. Hopefully it won't be the last time. Maybe we can do a legislative update when some of these things come down the pike, and hopefully not have to talk about a repeal of the Johnson Amendment. But thanks again for being my guest.
I would look forward to that anytime. Thank you so much, May. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Counsel Podcast. Are you ready to lead with clarity and confidence? Head to nonprofitcounsel.com to find the tools you need to start smart, lead strong, and create lasting impact.